Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited about this topic that we're having and the opportunity that we have. My name is Gus Gates. I'm the Washington Policy Manager with the Surfrider Foundation. Surfrider Foundation is a grassroots coastal conservation organization dedicated to the protection and the enjoyment of the world's ocean, waves, and beaches for all people through a powerful activist network. And tonight's webinar is being hosted by our Washington chapters, which includes our Northwest Straits chapter in Bellingham, Seattle chapter, South Sound chapter in Tacoma, the Olympia chapter, and the Olympic Peninsula chapter out on the wonderful and beautiful Olympic Peninsula, which will be the area that we're featuring tonight. I did want to give a big shout out to our coalition partners at Outdoor Alliance Washington Coalition. I see Connor Marshall here tonight. Big thanks to them and all of our partners for helping to spread the word and cast a wide audience, recognizing how special the Olympic coast is to so many recreational enthusiasts and Washingtonians. So without further ado, we have two wonderful speakers here with us tonight, Ashley and Laura, who are going to take it away. So have at it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gus. So I'm going to start us off tonight. I'm going to kind of introduce our presentation and then outline, and then I will be passing it on to Laura. So you'll be able to hear from both of us. Is the screen okay? We see everything good? Thank you. Okay. So as Gus mentioned, we are here to present some research and some background around our science. Laura will be talking in a second. I'll let Laura introduce herself. I'll be co-presenting, and we're both associated with the College of Forestry and the Forest Ecosystems and Society Department at Oregon State University. There's a number of different funders that have supported this work, and so I'm not going to go through all of these, but we did want to acknowledge and thank the many entities that have provided fundings for Laura, or specifically for some of the research activities that we'll be talking about today. So I'll introduce myself and then I'll pass it on to Laura to give her introduction. I'm an associate professor of nature-based recreation management at Oregon State. My specialty is recreation ecology and visitor use management broadly. I mostly work in national parks, but other protected areas in the United States as well. And really my work is focused on understanding ecological disturbance and balancing that with recreation access. Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. I'm going to start in Muskogee, by the way, my indigenous language, and then I'll translate everything to English. Hesje, Laura Jacobs, Choho Jeff Kados, Muskogee Murayes, Ahole Olge Doyes, Choctaws, Theahoki, Estongo. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Jacobs. I'm a citizen of Muskogee Creek Nation. I also have Choctaw heritage. I'm in the Potato Clan of my tribe. And how are you? I hope you're all doing well tonight. I'm also in the final year, hopefully, of my PhD studies at OSU, and I'm very excited to be here. So Modo, thank you so much for letting us have some space to talk to you about what we're up to.
Thank you, Laura. So here's our overview for this evening. I'm going to do a little recreation ecology primer just because folks may not be aware of recreation ecology as a research topic or field, and that again is Laura and I's specialty. And it's really going to inform the work that Laura is going to present, her current research project in the Olympic Peninsula. So then I'll pass it on to Laura after that kind of recreation ecology 101, and she'll talk a little bit about human waste in parks and protected areas. Buckle up, we're going to talk about poop a lot tonight, so just get the giggles out now. And then we'll specifically focus in on Laura's research and the work that we've been doing on Olympic beaches. And then we save time at the end to have a bit of a discussion around management practices and best practices. Because you know, it's the end of the day, we also have some interaction throughout. So don't worry, we're not going to say when to break out rooms tonight, but we do have some opportunities for you to engage with us via some polls and some questions. So be prepared for that as well. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick, maybe 10-15 minute overview of recreation ecology and recreation disturbances broadly, which will then set us up to understand the importance of the work that Laura has been doing. So I'm sure you're all pretty aware that a lot of folks enjoy outdoor recreation and really enjoy recreating in parks and protected areas, both terrestrial, marine, and coastal throughout the United States. Every year, the Outdoor Foundation does an outdoor participation report to try and estimate how many folks in the US are participating in outdoor recreation. The latest results show that close to 54% of folks in the US have participated in some form of outdoor recreation in the past year. And so we've got a lot of folks that are out there enjoying nature and participating in various outdoor recreational activities. And one of the basic tenets of recreation ecology is that if we allow recreational activities in natural areas, in our parks and protected areas, that some degree of disturbance is inevitable. And I put up this kind of silly cartoon that was actually about outdoor recreation impacts in Colorado, but it kind of illustrates some of the recreation disturbances that we might see and even has an individual pooping in the woods. So we know that we can't have outdoor recreation without having some level of disturbance. And that disturbance can occur to various aspects of the ecosystem, which we will go through a little bit in detail today. But pretty much no component of the ecosystem is completely insulated from recreation disturbance. But luckily, we have this field of recreation ecology that is the specialty that Laura and I are in. And our entire field is trying to understand these consequences of outdoor recreation, and importantly, their effective management. So not just what are the impacts, how are they happening, where are they happening, but how can we help managers mitigate these impacts to the natural world? And it's a very interdisciplinary field, as you'll see. I put like social science and ecological sciences up here, but when Laura gets to her part of the presentation, we're also working with engineers. And so this really requires a lot of work from a lot of different disciplines to manage these places. And the level of disturbance that we see from outdoor recreation is influenced by a lot of different factors. So for example, the ecosystem type. How recreation disturbs coastal systems might be different from how recreation disturbs a desert system, for example. The visitor behavior, which we'll talk a lot about today, right? How people poop in nature is going to influence the level of impact that we see. The timing of visitor use. So different times of the year, different systems are more sensitive. We can think about coastal bird species and their breeding season might be a time when they're especially sensitive to recreation disturbance compared to other times of the year. The number of visitors, which is something we attempted to measure in Laura's study. The type of visitor, is it motorized or non-motorized recreation? Is it hiking or biking? That can influence the level of disturbance we see. And then lastly, current environmental conditions, like how impacted is an area already, or is it kind of a location that's had very little disturbance? So these are various factors that we often measure as recreation ecologists. So I'm going to quickly, I know you aren't here to like take a class for me, so I'm not going to like dig into these in a lot of detail, but I did just want folks to come away today having some basic recreation ecology understanding to think about the impacts more broadly than just the couple that we're going to talk about today. So soil can be impacted by outdoor recreation. We can see in this video a lot of soil erosion that's occurring here. One of the other kind of really common ways that recreation can impact soils is through the loss of organic litter, right? Those leaves or pine needles, the detritus that sits on top can be lost from people trampling or recreating in an area. When that litter goes, then the next layer, that organic soil, that really rich soil, can also then leave from either erosion or trampling. We can have soil compaction, which is again from basically trampling or having some sort of pressure from recreation on those soils, which can result in fewer spaces for air or water to sit within those soil particles, which can lead to decreases in soil moisture and ultimately a lot of soil erosion. This can also then compound how vegetation can grow in these places, right? If you've ever tried and like plant something in really compacted soil, it can be like really hard to dig. And it can be hard for plants to have their roots kind of penetrate those soils. So when we think about outdoor recreation disturbances, a lot of these are very interrelated. So even though Laura's going to talk a lot about pathogenic impacts, people going off trail to use the restroom can also lead to vegetation and soil impacts. From a vegetation standpoint, we can see most of the disturbance to vegetation from outdoor recreation occurs from trampling. So again, folks kind of stepping on vegetation. We can also have trampling in marine systems. There's been some studies looking at the impact of outdoor recreation trampling in systems of coral or kelp. But I mostly work in terrestrial systems, so those are kind of my examples today. But trampling can damage that above ground tissue of those plants, as we can see here in this image in this meadow. When that tissue of those plants gets trampled and stomped on, it can reduce the plant's vigor, so how healthy it is and its abundance. Combining that with soil compaction, you can have changes in the overall plant community. So generally what we see from recreation impacts to vegetation are things like loss of vegetation, changes in the types of plants that are in those locations. The spread of non-native species can also occur from trampling behaviors, tree damage, root exposure. You can sometimes have more direct impacts such as folks cutting trees or cutting branches. And then shrubs are actually really sensitive to recreation. So oftentimes places that have really heavy recreation use, especially off trail, will have a loss of those shrub species. And those shrubs are, again, have very low resistance to recreation. So we can see that different sorts of plants are going to respond differently. And so the key takeaway, again, is that in some systems, the plants may be more sensitive than others when it comes to recreation disturbance. Wildlife disturbance. So not only can outdoor recreation impact soil and vegetation, but we can have impact to wildlife species, both terrestrial and marine. Wildlife impacts are generally kind of two types. So we can have direct impacts. These are when folks are actually like directly interacting with wildlife. So getting too close to a wildlife species or an individual, feeding wildlife. But we can also have indirect impacts from habitat modification. So just the presence of recreation in a system can actually cause disturbance to wildlife species. So just having trails, having recreation in those areas can lead to some disturbance. And again, we can have habitat modification, which might ultimately result in species displacement. So if a species is very sensitive to outdoor recreation and we have recreation in those places, species that are sensitive may move out of that location. So for example, again, I mostly work in terrestrial systems, so I'm sorry for using very terrestrial examples. But in Grand Teton National Park, there's an amazing ski resort, right? And just outside the park, Teton Village. And that is really great habitat nearby there for bighorn sheep. But because recreation is in that area, the bighorn sheep will not use that habitat and they get displaced into areas that has less habitat that's less good for them, which can impact their populations. We can also see altered behavior like habituation, like we see with this bison here in Yellowstone. That can lead to changes in reproduction and ultimately changes in the species that you find in places that have a lot of outdoor recreation. Okay, bear with me, I've got two more and then we're gonna have something interactive. So water quality and disturbance, we're kind of transitioning into the topics that we're gonna focus on for our study. Outdoor recreation can influence water quality and lead to disturbances in water-based systems. Some of this happens from use actually in the water. Other impacts are related to use kind of at the interface of the terrestrial system and the marine or the riparian system. So we can have changes in temperature or water flow from recreational activities. Recreational activities on the shoreline or kind of at that interface between the terrestrial and the marine or terrestrial and riparian can change nutrient inputs into the system, which can ultimately result in changes in dissolved oxygen. We can also have impacts from pathogens, which Laura's going to talk a lot about today, or pollutants. So in systems where we have like motorized recreation occurring, we can have pollutants related to gasoline or oil or other things that occur in those systems. And lastly, the behavior of moving in and out of the water and the land can result in turbidity, so matter being suspended up into the water, which can have kind of more short-term, but kind of point impacts to that recreation system. Air quality, we can also have outdoor recreation impact air quality. This is often through the burning of hydrocarbons for motorized use, also particulate matter, typically from campfire use, but we also mentioned prescribed burning that sometimes happens in our parks and protected areas. And then the last little bit of our recreation ecology 101 is something that I call emerging impacts. So we're more and more thinking about how outdoor recreation might be impacting people's ability to enjoy night skies or wildlife's ability to function in dark places and soundscapes, which again can have impacts not only just to the visitor experience, but to wildlife species as well. Okay, so what does all this have to do with our topic for today? So recreation ecology is actually a fairly new field in the United States. It's only really been around since the 80s. And our really early studies really focus just on vegetation and soil. Like, how do we trample plants? What does that impact? And really focused a lot on terrestrial systems. Increasingly, there's been an interest in wildlife-related studies, but again, mostly focused within terrestrial landscapes. Less well understood are things like impacts to water, especially in marine systems, these pathogenic impacts that Laura is going to talk about, impacts to air quality, and then again, night skies and soundscapes. So the work, again, and these are interrelated, I do want to mention that impacts to vegetation can then cascade to impacts to wildlife, or impacts to soil can lead to further impacts into water. But really the key takeaway is that we understand a lot of these disturbances fairly well, but the ones that Laura is focusing on are some of the first studies to really look at some of the impacts that recreation use and human disturbance has in some of these marine systems, and especially focused on these pathogenic impacts and disturbances. So now you can say you've had the primer course in recreation ecology, and we're going to kind of move on to a few interactive questions before I pass it on to Laura to talk about the specifics around human waste and marine systems. So Laura, do you want to explain how the Slido works, since you are the pro on this, please?
We're going to use professional as as in italics, because I'm pretty much not one yet. So I put a link in the chat. Hopefully you all can access that, or you can type it in on your own. The link's on the screen. And we're going to go through these questions kind of one by one. Ashley's going to read them out. But if you have multiple things to add to one question, hit enter or hit submit in between each one, because we're going to build some word clouds. We're going to do some polling too. But yeah, if there's multiple things you want to put, just hit enter and we'll build some things together as we go.
Thanks, Laura. With my screens, it's hard for me to see the browser, so I'm going to defer to you to like report out some of the findings, if that's okay. I need a third screen today to, to do this. So our first question we'd like you to respond to is, what recreation related ecological impacts are on your mind? I talked about a few today, but what are the things that is most concerning to you as an individual, or the organization that you are representing this evening?
Okay, so some of the answers that are coming in, and by the way, this is all anonymous. We can't trace this back to you. Okay, so if you have something to say that you don't want connected to your name, you're in the right place. But some of the things that we're seeing so far populate on the screen are disturbance to wildlife, water quality, pollution, waste, water, oxybenzone, bleaching coral, overuse, interdunal wetland impacts, drones scaring wildlife. So there's a lot of diverse things that are on people's minds, which is good, because these are a lot of things that are on recreation ecologists' minds too. You know, impacts to tribes. I love that one. That's an amazing one. Yeah, overuse. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good accounting of that one. If you want to do the next one.
Yeah.
And
so now we're
so
going to start. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
So just stay on this link the entire time. Don't close your webpage, because it'll auto populate the next question, and it should be up. Okay.
So we're now kind of zoning into the specific topic for our talk tonight. So again, this is anonymous. No one's going to link this back to you. When you are in a park or protected area and you're away from restroom facilities, what do you do with your poop?
There's no judgment, by the way. Maybe a little bit, just a tiny bit. No judgment this early on in the presentation. I'll put it that way. We're starting to get some good responses. So far, 78% of people say they bury it in a cat hole. And then we have about 33% who are saying they pack it out. Okay. We have a few people, about 11%, who say that they will use a portable toilet.
Ooh.
Okay. Cool.
Great.
All right.
All right. So since our study really focuses on camping, our next question is camping specific. So imagine you're camping on a beach and there are no restrooms nearby. How far away from the campsite will you travel to poop? And this is, again, I think this is a multiple choice one again, correct, Laura?
Yes. Yep. Within 5 feet, 5 to 10 feet, 10 to 20, or 20 plus. We have like 100% so far out of 8 people who say 20 plus feet away from campsites.
Okay. maybe have some
Actually,
folks, oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
all 100% now.
Okay, we might have some folks that are familiar with leave no trace principles in our group this evening. Okay, last question before we kind of move on to the next part of our presentation. And I believe this is yes or no. You cannot say I don't know, you have to pick one. Does burying your fecal matter leave no trace?
We did put an it depends on that one.
Oh, okay,
This is
good.
the only one.
As in true scientists, there has to be a gray area.
Has to be.
Okay, so we'll give you a minute to answer that one.
Okay, we have
And
90% people so far say no, and then we have 10% who say it depends.
okay.
Okay, these are good answers.
Yeah, those are good answers. And hopefully after the second part of our presentation, I'm going to stop sharing for now and turn it over to Laura. You'll have some more concrete answers to some of these questions. So we'll do a quick transition so you don't have to hear us say next slide over and over again. We're going to let Laura drive the presentation.
Liz, can you give me the ability to share my screen? There we go. Okay. Let's get this going. Give me 1 second. Okay. So let's talk about poop. Let's talk about human waste in parks and protected areas. And this is going to be an interesting discussion, I think, and we'll still have some more interactive things going on in this segment of the presentation. But human waste has been kind of a topic that managers of parks and protected areas have had to deal with and figure out creative management schemes to deal, to navigate for decades. In the 90s, there was a survey of park managers all across the United States. And in that survey, 25% of them responded that human fecal waste disposal issues was a pretty common problem in parks and protected areas. So this problem has been around for kind of a while, where we're trying to figure out what do we do with all of this human waste, right? Especially in remote areas. But as outdoor recreation increases, as we're seeing larger and larger amounts of people coming into outdoor spaces, especially wilderness areas, we're having increasing issues of what parks and protected areas might need to do in terms of management for human fecal waste issues. But one of the things I want to talk to you about, especially since my research takes place in Olympic National Park, is the element about park designation, because it can really complicate how park and protected areas can actually manage human waste. And most of that in terms of Olympic National Park is because 95% of the park is designated wilderness, right? It's a huge park. Almost all of it is a wilderness area. And according to the Wilderness Act, which I'm sure you are all pretty familiar with, it dictates that most of these areas have to remain undeveloped, that they have to retain this idea of natural character without permanent improvements. As an Indigenous person, I have some feelings about the Wilderness Act and the term wilderness, but I won't jump off in that tangent today. But it's part of the reality of why there are difficulties managing things as wilderness. But there's also this idea that inside of the Wilderness Act that we have to manage these landscapes in a way that they are untrammeled by men. So these requirements mean that park managers, especially Olympic National Park managers, have to focus on visitor use impacts, and they have to manage things in a way that allows them to recreate, right? So we usually see things like trails being built into parks, but when it comes to human waste facilities, it's pretty minimal, especially in wilderness areas. So we usually see like one pit toilet for a fairly large ecosystem or landscape, and they're usually scarcely scattered about. So if you're way at the end of one trail, you're probably not going to make it back to that pit toilet. So that is kind of like an issue that's starting to arise in management discussions. Like, how do we manage under these policies in these designated areas when we can't really do a lot of building or infrastructure for facilities and things like that. So there's some common practices, as we all know. The most common practice that people are doing when they are out and about, especially in like wilderness areas, is to dig a cat hole. And Leave No Trace, like for decades now, has told people that this is an amazing idea. You just need to dig a hole about 6 to 8 inches deep, be about at least 200 feet away from water, which is very difficult to do on a marine beach, by the way, especially since the tide moves in and out all day long. Or use a pit toilet, right? Those are our most common practices, but they're not necessarily the best practice. And we've actually known that at the scientific level since like the 80s. So a couple of questions that I want you to kind of hold in your mind as we're going through this presentation, or at least this part of it, are, does burying your fecal matter actually result in recreationists leaving no trace? I think we had like 100% of you said no to that, right? With some people saying, well, it kind of depends. Another question is, does human fecal matter really just disappear and decompose over time? These are things that we'll dive into and we'll talk about. So the answer to the first one is no, it doesn't really just leave no trace. There's always traces of pathogens, might not be things we can see with the human eye, but it's definitely things we can see and grow in labs. So we have known since the 1980s. I was born in 85, so I'm 37. We've known since like 1981, so a lot older than me here, that the shallow burial of feces actually doesn't lead to timely destruction of fecal coliform pathogens. So fecal coliform pathogens, I'm going to talk about these in the next slide a little bit more, but it's like things like E. coli and salmonella and things that we actually pass through our gastrointestinal tract out through our fecal matter. So we know that when we're burying feces, even in the sand, even following leave no trace principles, that it's not actually going to destroy those in like a timely manner. We also know that bacteria survive in soils in large numbers during summer and fall, especially when we have lots of outdoor recreation, and the depth of burial doesn't actually really matter when it comes to bacteria's ability to be able to persist. So if it's 3 inches, if it's 6 inches, if it's a foot down, science shows us that that doesn't really matter. So what are fecal coliform bacteria? These are bacteria that indicate that there has been recent fecal matter contamination. And usually we find them in water. Sometimes we can find them in soils, things like that. And we have different indicator bacteria within the fecal coliform umbrella, if you will, that we use to analyze, what type of contamination is happening in different environmental samples, like E. coli, which is a big thing that I use in my work. And I also use just coliforms in general. Like this slide here, I'm not sure if you can see the color differences. I'm sorry that I don't have a better picture, but it shows some really dark dots and it shows some kind of lighter ones. The dark ones are blue. The other ones, like kind of right here, those are pink. The pink ones are fecal coliforms. The dark ones are E. coli. And this is from one sample that I took actually out on one of the beaches, second beach or third beach out in the Olympic National Park in the marine water. So there's just, one sample. There's a lot of coliforms going on in there, and there's a lot of E. coli going on in there. But fecal coliforms, the levels of those will increase with human activity. And they're usually highest after the peak of summer tourism, which makes sense, right? When we have lots of people coming out and coming out and coming out, and then everyone goes back to work and school and things like that, we're going to see a peak in bacterial levels. And then sometimes it dies down. It doesn't always die down though. But coliform levels are generally correlated with the prevalence of infections in the local animal populations. So this is something to think about, right? All mammals and even birds, when we poop, we all have different types of bacteria that we can put into ecosystems. If it's waters, if it's sands, if it's soils, we all have E. coli even that we transmit through our fecal matter. And so even animals can create issues in the outdoors and waters and soils and things like that. This isn't just a human only issue. But coliform levels are also correlated with the frequency of recreational activity in watersheds as well. So let's think about poop, let's think about bacteria and think about what that means in terms of environmental contamination. So the improper disposal of human feces is going to contaminate waterways and soils, right? Because they have pathogens in them. Those pathogens can spread, but they can't just like spread around in the dirt and in the water. They can actually spread diseases to other outdoor recreationists and to other animals. Like we can transmit different bacteria to animals just as they can to us. And that's not fun whenever you have a brand new disease that emerges sometimes in the human population, which some of us might be familiar with these days. But pathogens are going to exist naturally as well in the environment, right? So it's not just from humans. may not just be from like a recent fecal input from animals, but pathogens can just exist there naturally as well, even without recreation, even without any recent fecal input to the system. So this is kind of a interesting question for everyone. I hope it's still on the screen. So I have to switch back and forth here because I'm managing the Slido poll. But go back to your Slido and we are going to ask a question. And this is just a pretty quick one. Have you ever been treated with antibiotics before? And I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to look at that. And we can watch it in real time on my screen here. So 100%. Most of us have, right? I mean, one person hasn't. Okay. So antibiotics, they're amazing. They do really great things. They help us fight disease, but there's problems with antibiotics. So how many of you have like ever used hand sanitizer? I'm sure a lot of us have, especially in COVID days these days. Hand sanitizer usually says that it's 99.9% effective. And if you've ever wondered what's on the other, 0.1% of that, most likely what they're talking about with the efficacy range there is the fact that the more and more we use like hand soaps and things like that, antibacterial soaps, the more we are making different bacteria resistant to those treatments, right? It's the same thing with antibiotics. So as we take even just one course of antibiotics, and I'm not saying this to get you not to take antibiotics, they're good, they help us. Just my disclaimer there, and talk with your doctor. This is not medical advice. But as we take antibiotics, there's always some types of bacteria in our system that are going to grow immune to those. They're going to start resisting those, okay? So think about how many people are taking antibiotics every day. We have something that among like environmental engineers and ecologists, we call a silent pandemic. And it's the growing prevalence of antibiotic resistance bacteria. It's everywhere. It's inside of us. It's in our ecosystems. It's in our sands and our waters because of human impacts, right? Antibiotic resistant bacteria has been identified, obviously, as an environmental contaminant of concern. These are things we aren't really talking about in terms of like human health outcomes, but at some point in the very near future, our antibiotics are going to stop working. And there's only so many generations of antibiotics we can get out of specific ones. So there's a lot of like people in public health and the medical industry who are like frantically trying to develop new ones as we are constantly becoming more and more resistant to them. I promise all of this is going to make sense about antibiotics soon. But so far, most antibiotic resistant bacteria studies are really just focused on like wastewater treatment facilities, because that's where most of our poop goes, right? We flush it down the toilet, it goes out to the wastewater treatment plant, they treat it, and then they want to see what happens. How many, of our samples or how much water or effluent or whatever in those samples actually still has antibiotic resistant bacteria. Those numbers are like increasing, which isn't really great, but we also have studies that are generally focused on agricultural runoff because, we treat our animals and stuff with antibiotics for human consumption these days. But we're starting to see a small number of studies that have assessed antibiotic resistant bacteria in remote environments. So like in park and protected areas, we don't have a lot of research yet to actually create big, broad theories to like definitively say how these things are working yet, because we're just now starting to crack the surface, especially when we're trying to understand where that antibiotic resistant bacteria actually originated from in different areas. So we have like three projects that have been published so far in different national parks and protected areas in the United States that have studied outdoor recreation-derived antibiotic-resistant abundance. That is a mouthful. But one of those was in Rocky Mountain National Park, one was in Cache La Poudre and South Platte Rivers in Colorado, and one was in Lechuguilla Cave, in New Mexico. Obviously, these aren't marine areas, right? So this goes back to what Ashley was saying. Most of our science and recreation ecology is super land-based. It's very terrestrial. And when we think about how many people are recreating in marine systems, there's a lot we don't know about those impacts. And obviously, antibiotic resistance is just this like very brand new idea to the field in general. But there's, since we don't have many marine studies at all as it is, having like a marine study that focuses on antibiotic resistance from human fecal matter, it just doesn't exist yet. So none of these studies have really taken place in those types of areas. They haven't ever looked at wilderness areas either. But then there's another problem. We can look at those studies and we can see how antibiotic resistance happens in those different ecosystems, but it's not site specific. And bacteria are small, right? We can't really see them with our human eyes. They can do other things that we might not think about, and we'll get to that soon. But one ecosystem from another is going to be very distinct. The amount of use, the type of use, the ecosystem elements, the rain, the humidity, the sun, all of it, the temperature, all of those things impact the ability for bacteria to survive in a system. So we always have to have studies that are site specific, which is crazy because it's expensive. Like I think our project is like $25,000 to $30,000 of just research equipment, like not to pay us to do work, but just equipment for 2 beaches. And so it's hard to correlate what's happening in other areas with one area, but we're trying to build enough knowledge across sciences so that we can at some point be able to do that. So we have a lot of knowledge gaps. And the field of recreation ecology doesn't really have a lot of information about fecal matter and marine systems or antibiotic resistance or anything like that. But let's talk more about Washington, because Washington is the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to turn on another question for you. Okay. Have you ever come across human poop, toilet paper, or other indicators of human waste disposal when recreating on Olympic beaches? Now, this question assumes that you've been recreating out there. If you haven't, then, that's okay. But if you have noticed that, yeah, put yes in the chat. You can see we have about, so far, 86% of people who've said yes. So this isn't just something that, just a couple scientists or other people are noticing. There's other folks who are noticing these issues in these systems as well. Let's talk about 2 case studies that we've been working on for a pretty good amount of time now. Okay. Our case studies actually take place up in Olympic National Park on 2 different beaches. But like Ashley said, recreation ecology sometimes takes a lot of different disciplines. So this is my dissertation committee. These are the experts that I have to have who oversee my work. We have a recreation ecologist, an environmental engineer. We have a conservation and disease ecologist, a wildlife ecologist, a marine law and ocean governance specialist who has a JD and a PhD. And we have an indigenous environmental physicist. There's a lot of different expertise that we have to kind of navigate when we're thinking about these things. And it's too much work for one person. So I have tons of different types of fieldwork assistants, data assistants, GIS mapping assistants, cellular methods, molecular methods assistants. There's been a ton of people who've been involved in this project so far, and actually a whole nother lab that I'm not even showing their faces on who helped us with some of the antibiotic resistant stuff. But the main overarching issue behind our project is that there's been a lot of increases in outdoor recreation up in Washington, right? And different types of outdoor recreation have been increasing, but with those increases, we've seen increases in human waste as well, especially on 2nd and 3rd beaches, which sit adjacent to the Quileute Reservation and La Push. And, just to ground you, if you've never been out there, it's an incredible place. They're beautiful lands. There's also 1 pit toilet on each of these beaches, but they're kind of in like gnarly places. And some people, don't want to walk all the way back to a pit toilet if you're all the way down at the other end of the beach to use the restroom. So what we've been trying to figure out is to what degree does the increased prevalence of human fecal matter in these areas actually play a role in contaminating the surrounding ecosystem? So we're looking at the ecosystem scale. In this project, we look at namely the products, if you will, of outdoor recreation, which is human fecal matter, and how it contaminates sand and soils and moves out to the ocean. And then what that means for humans, especially people like the tribe that live next door that are there, doing subsistence fishing and things like that, or outdoor recreationists in general who are in the park visiting. So I've got a question before I move on to this, but do you think bacteria can travel across a landscape? And I ask this because when we first started this project, I had a lot of people kind of look at us weirdly, and they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean that you think it can move out to the water? This is kind of a guiding theory that's guiding our project. And you guys are smart. 100% of you so far said yes. Okay, so no surprises here. That's good. But I'm going to talk to you about our theory and how we are slowly trying to build a theory on this that is supported by other studies from like wastewater effluent that's been in in systems and stuff like that. So let's pretend that we have a landscape so far. Think of one of those beaches, if you've ever been to one, that doesn't have any outdoor recreation, like maybe right after the rainy season, there's not anyone there. Over the summer, we have lots of hikers and campers and day users and everything like that come into the system, right? Well, they might be down at the southern parts of the beach away from the trailhead. So we're going to start seeing poop coming into our ecosystems. And I've seen a lot of poop there. I had to map it. I'll talk about that soon, but you can see it. It's on the surface. There's also indicators below the surface that show us where it's at. But as that poop sits there, you know, we start getting pathogens that are transmitted into those sands and soils. By the way, so this is like dry sand up here. This is wet sand. This is water, if you're wondering what the different colors are. But we know from science, from multiple studies, that water is like this vehicle that bacteria use to transport across an ecosystem, which is why they say with leave no trace policies, hey, don't poop within 20 or 200 feet from a waterway. On a beach, that's really hard because the water levels are going all over the place, right? But this is also Washington. Washington gets a lot of rain. You guys get tons of rain. The La Push area gets an average of 109 inches of rain per year. So that's a lot of vehicles, right? That's a lot of raindrops that are able to move bacteria around a system. And so maybe it's so much water that some of the fecal matter washes out, but just the washing out process doesn't mean that it's a cleansing process, right? It's just moving bacteria. And so we start seeing, according to our theory, that bacteria can potentially make it out to the water, even if it starts out in the forest. So some of the things that we've done in this project, we do a lot of GIS mapping. So we can take locations of our samples and things like that, and even track where camping has been done. We do a lot of environmental sampling, always underneath poop or, moving out towards the water. We do water sampling as well. I'm wearing a very funny hood in this picture, and that's not normal for a cellular or molecular biologist, I promise. That's because I am significantly allergic to shellfish, and shellfish were a part of our project, but we're not going to talk about that for this presentation. But because this is a wilderness area and I had to build a lab way up there and stuff, I had to wear some special equipment and look a little goofy in the process, just to make sure we were safe. So let's talk about some of the stuff we've done in this project. The first thing you do in any recreation project, usually in recreation ecology, is you have to identify what kind of use is going on and how much is going on, sometimes where it's going on at. So we identified where people were camping, and we did this over multiple months of 2021, so last year. And these are our hotspots. So here's Second Beach. You can see most of it's happening, like camping is happening on the north end of the beach, not as much down at the bottom end. If you're looking for a good camping site, maybe come down here. Third Beach, though, Third Beach is kind of all over the place, but you can see as our circles go inward and the red spots are there, that's where the predominant types of camping are at. Where are people pooping? So we actually built some poop maps. I had to go out and locate fecal matter for 2 months. That was a really gross job, but someone has to do it. So one thing to keep an eye on of this, and I'm going to go back to that previous slide. Look at where people are camping. Look at where people are pooping. We'll go back again. Very similar, right? That's why we asked the question, how far are you going to poop away from your campsite? What happens if you can't poop very far away from your campsite, especially on one of these beaches, right? Some people are just kind of going right beside it. Now, one thing that this map doesn't show is that we did like daily surveys of these beaches for poop. So some of this poop can be redundant on the map. And also there are sites where multiple people would come and poop on top of other poop, which is kind of gross. Like, I'm not sure if I would do that. Some people are doing it, though. Lots of people are out there. And so we started creating hotspots of where we know that there's like group pooping going on and, poop that is maintaining in the system even after the tides wash in and out. And most of those are, again, kind of centered toward, kind of near the trailheads. But Third Beach, it was kind of all over the place. And there's a forested area on Third Beach. Well, no, hold on. I won't get to that. Never mind. Anyways, so after we did our mapping, we also did a bunch of things in the field. Like I said, I built a lab and we had to isolate and quantify E. coli. Those are weird words, but all that really means is that when you take a sample from the environment, you're going to have a ton of bacteria, thousands of bacteria we don't even know how to identify, right? So we want to do different methods so we can pick apart the type of bacteria that we need to identify fecal matter. So we used E. coli as our identifier, we isolated it, and we were able to count it. Then we brought it all back to Oregon State University so that we can confirm that I didn't mess things up in the field. It's always good to have confirmation. And we were able to do that with other types of tests to make sure we actually had E. coli. And those are cool tests because we actually make it glow. So it'll glow on some of our confirmation tests. But up in the field, you can see like this is one sample right here. I hope you can see my mouse. And this is another sample. And really, it's a guessing game. When you're out in the field, you take an environmental sample of sand or soil or water. You don't know how much bacteria is going to be there, right? Like I would scoop stuff underneath poop and I would know there's going to be a lot of bacteria in here, but other places you don't know. So we would have to take multiple plates and do different serial dilutions, kind of dilute it out there so that we could get it into this range right here so we could actually count it. And then we open things up. And when I said we bring it back with us, we do. We actually scoop out some of these colonies of E. coli, bring them back to OSU. And what we ended up with was about 83 water samples. No, 83 isolates. Those are the individual colonies that we brought back, and 117 sand and soil isolates. So that doesn't mean that's all the bacteria that we counted. That's just, we would take a couple from each plate. So these came from different water sources and different sand and soil sources. There's about 200 that we brought back, which is a ton of work when we have to go through all the rest of the testing. I'm going to get into some language here that's, one thing about science has a lot of jargon. There's a lot of words that are just weird, but sometimes we don't have words to replace them, especially like in science communication. So I'm just going to tell you what these are. There's genotype and phenotype. So in the next slides, I'll be talking about genotypic and phenotypic forms of resistance, but let's talk about what those mean before we get there. So genotype is like your genetic code. It's your DNA, it's your genetic makeup, right? Your phenotype is the expression of that genotype that we can observe. It's the traits of that genotype. The way that I like to think about this is if you think of breast cancer, a person who has breast cancer right now is like phenotypically showing it. It's active, right? But maybe that person has a daughter. Maybe she's 18 or 20, and maybe that daughter wants to see if she has a chance to get breast cancer in the future. Then we can look at her genotype. We can identify different markers in it and see if, maybe she's carrying some type of genetic marker that will turn on later, which would be phenotypic, right? So we can look at the genotype, which doesn't necessarily have to be turned on yet. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So phenotypic, which means it's turned on, it's active. This is the first testing that we did to see what type of antibiotic resistance and susceptibility. So susceptibility means that a bacteria will be susceptible or it will die off because of an antibiotic. Resistant means no, the antibiotic's not going to be able to treat it. So we used a Vitek 2 machine. These are crazy, interesting machines. We actually partnered with a different lab to do it. There's a big list of different antibiotics here on the right that we kind of went through, but it allowed us to take each of our isolates and test them for all these different antibiotics to see if they were resistant or if antibiotics would actually work against them. And it also allowed us to see something called extended spectrum beta lactamase. Now these, like any type of bacteria that are ESBL producing bacteria, are horrible. Like they're things you don't want to see in your studies. They're things you don't want to mess with. They are things you don't want to come across because they are exceptionally difficult to treat with antibiotics. Those are the bacteria where we would see like resistances to everything, right? If you come across something like that, your medical professionals are going to be bummed out, and so are you. You better hope you have a really great immune system because those are gnarly bacteria. But we used the machine because it helped us see what kind of common antibiotics we could test against that usually treat E. coli infections. The good news is we had a lot of the antibiotics that had no resistance. So, it was susceptible, it's good stuff. But we did have some that have like more common antibiotics that had resistances to lots of different samples. So ampicillin, which is very common, about a third of our isolates were resistant to that. Active resistance, right? They're actively resistant today. almost 40% of our sand and soil samples had ampicillin resistance. About 22% of our water samples showed it. Tetracycline is only about 10% of our isolates, which was 16% of our sand and soil and about 1% of our water. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, that's a mouthful. I've gotten better at saying it too. They only had about 7% of isolates, but that's still, 7% is 7%. And all of those were from sand and soil, which is interesting, but also it's not interesting because the ocean is huge, right? It's always churning, it's always moving around, and it's going to diffuse and things like that. So even finding some in just a random sample of ocean waters can be kind of concerning. There's also sparse resistances to various other types of antibiotics, but the big one is the ESBL. Remember, the dangerous one. Now, before I talk about this one, I want to tell you that one of my committee members worked specifically in like wastewater treatment plants, looking at this type of bacteria and other types of bacteria that are coming out of them. When we first got these results, she said, that can't be right. You're seeing more ESBL than we are in wastewater treatment facilities. And that's not good because that's where all the poop goes, right? If we're seeing more on our beaches than we are at a wastewater treatment facility, that's kind of concerning. But most of them were in soil samples again. And it was only 5%, but the 5% is kind of where it gets a little scary. So overall, sand and soil isolates actually had more antibiotic resistant bacteria than water isolates, which makes some sense. But we also looked at the differences across beaches. We did a bunch of statistics on this too, but we're not reporting out statistics because those are boring. This is just stuff so you can look at percentages. But ampicillin was really kind of similar across beaches, about 34% from second beach, about 30% from first beach. Tetracycline, pretty similar, about 11% on second, 9% on third. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole was about 20% from second, but a lot less on third beach. So we only had about 2%, which was 2 isolates from third beach. Again, we had lots of sparse resistance. And then our ESBL showed about 5% of isolates again, but my computer's dying. Hold on one second, sorry. Even though it showed sparse resistance, because I'm trying to plug in my computer, sorry. All of it came from second beach. None of it's on third beach, at least from the samples that we took. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist on third beach, but the random sampling approach that we took didn't indicate that it was there. So that gives us a bunch of question marks, like why is it only on second beach in those samples? Gentamycin's kind of an outlier. It was more on third beach, but only about like 2 samples. So we saw second beach having the predominant issues of antibiotic resistance E. coli. However, it's on both beaches. So resistant is resistant. We also do genotypic antibiotic resistance testing so that we can understand what may be happening with these isolates later, right? They might not be resistant today, they might turn on later with that resistance. And so genotypic antibiotic resistance will show us which bacteria have resistance right now. They confirm the phenotypic testing, but they also tell us which ones might turn on later. Okay, so we haven't done our ESBL yet. We're still working on that. We have 200 samples and have to run 1 test for each one of them. It's a lot of work. But we did do sulfonamide, which is a common antibiotic resistance that we're seeing to antibiotics from E. coli, and it's growing. So this is kind of identified as one we need to double check. And so far, about 22% of those are resistant genetically or genotypically, so they might turn on. We don't know the difference yet on if these are the same ones that are already showing that active resistance. It's more work we need to do. But we're also looking at human sources, right? Like I said, E. coli lives naturally in the environment. So we have to make sure it actually comes from humans. And we have different human genetic markers that we can look at when we look at E. coli's DNA to see its points of origin. And 2 of those are called H8 and H12. Now, I want you to think about something. There is a wide diversity of humans on this planet, right? There's a lot of diversity of outdoor recreationists out there. So we can't just use one genetic marker. It's not going to pick up everyone. We can't just usually use 2. There are tons of different genetic markers that a person would use typically in a study. These studies are really expensive to do. So we limited it to 2 of these markers, to H8 and H12, knowing that we're not covering a full human spectrum here. but we're also using another one called NTI1. And these are just weird names. I don't know how they come up with them, but that's just what they are. But this one is also used so we can kind of do this triangulation to confirm that it's a human source, right? So we're using 3 different ones. Now, H8 might have totally different results than H12, and NTI1 might have totally different results from all these, but we're trying to cast the broadest net possible, right? So H8, we had about 24% of our samples that tested positive for human origin so far. But again, that doesn't mean that only 1/4 of our results so far are from humans. That means that at least 1/4 are. In Taiwan, we have at least 20% on that one that are positive at this point, but that's a partial data set. So that number might increase, it might not. And we're starting H12 soon. The last thing that we're doing in this project is we're looking at virulence and pathogenicity. Those are weird words, right? Virulence and pathogenicity really show us how hazardous these bacteria can be to human health, right? Maybe they aren't bad. You can have antibiotic resistance bacteria that isn't ever going to cause a disease in you. So, not all E. coli are bad either. Some of them actually help with our GI tracts and how we function, how we're able to metabolize food and process that and expel our waste. Some of them are beneficial to us. Not all cause disease, but it's important for us to know what kind of pathogens we're dealing with, or if they're even disease-causing bacteria or not. So we're still working on those markers. But E. coli, there's only 6 family groups of diseases that E. coli can cause to humans, but there are tons of different kinds of E. coli that don't cause anything. So not all of it's harmful. These numbers might look scary, on these other slides, but not all of it's harmful, and we don't know the degree of harm yet, but we're working on it. So what does our data show us? It shows us that we can trace back some of our bacteria to human fecal matter. It shows us that antibiotic-resistant bacteria are found in soils, sands, and waters at various magnitude and, on distinct beaches. We also know from science, and this is really scary, that bacteria can naturalize in those areas. And there's something called horizontal gene transfers that happen, where bacteria can kind of communicate with other bacteria and pass along different characteristics, like handing over a letter going, hey, you need this resistance too. And then you can have a whole ecosystem, or a whole part of an ecosystem that can become resistant to something. So going back to that silent pandemic, we're kind of feeding into that silent pandemic. But we also know that depositing human fecal matter in marine areas, even when it's buried, and a lot of this stuff was buried, lots of it was unburied, but no matter how you do it, it's going to leave a trace, right? And we know that recreationists are leaving these little microscopic traces that we might not be able to see with our human eye that can contribute potentially to human health hazards, even creating issues where some of those might be really difficult to treat. But there's good news. This isn't like a doomsday scenario because it's all preventable, right? It all comes down to what we're doing as people and our ability to know how to poop in the great outdoors. So best practices are like the easiest thing in the world. What can we do? First thing you have to do is plan ahead and prepare, right? If you go out before a trip, or before you go out on a trip, look at the ecosystem, see where you're at, look at a map, go and look and see where restroom facilities exist. If you're going to be out on the trail for multiple days, maybe try to plan to do your camping near a restroom facility if it exists. If it doesn't exist, if you're going to go out on a trail for a long time, or if you want to camp at the other end of a beach from everyone else who's gathered up by a trail, then plan accordingly. And what you can do is you can buy things like wag bags. Now, this is one brand, but there's a lot of different types of these. I'm just using wag bag because it's kind of like the umbrella term at this point for all these bags. But wag bags are what outdoor recreationists are starting to turn to very slowly turning to these. They're large bags. They're kind of filled with this powder that kind of gelatinizes the waste, right? It kind of composes it a little bit into a gel, and it allows you to carry it out. They don't stink. They don't do anything. They typically don't leak unless you've done it wrong. But it allows you to carry it out so you can bring it back home and you throw it in the trash. I have some qualms about that throwing it in the trash part though, because what are we doing? We're just passing off the problem to a different ecosystem, right? To a different landfill. What we really need, and I was just talking to Ashley about this yesterday, we need, and maybe one of you can invent this, I don't know, or maybe there's one and I don't know about it, We need bags where we can just like open them up and like when we get home and flush the poop down the toilet and put them in our wastewater treatment areas and have them deal with it. But I don't know if that exists yet. So especially like one that's not like a dog bag, right? That would stink in your backpack. We don't want that. But what we want to know from you, and we're going to open this up to discussion pretty quick here. We have 2 more questions for you. Let me turn one on. What's your readiness level to start packing out your poop in protected areas? And if you're not ready, that's okay. This is a scale question. The person in paints is basically the one that says it's not happening. Like if you're going, I'm not going to touch my poop. I'm not going to bring that out with me. Okay. The heart face is like, I'm already doing this. What are you talking about? You know, I didn't even need this lecture today or this workshop. We have some people with the heart face. I like that. Oh, it's going down though. Okay, so we're in the middle. We're just like the meh, you know, okay. I don't know if I'm ready. That's okay. At least you're honest. Let's go and answer another question then. What barriers exist for you or other recreationists in following these practices? And so, like I said, if there's multiple things that you want to input on one of these slides, this will help us build a word cloud. Put a word, hit enter, put another word, hit enter, whatever you want to do there. There's multiple things. But these are the important things that we are trying to deal with in our science. What is this information, right? Why don't people want to carry out their poop? We do it for our dogs. I mean, some people will, okay, this is a pet peeve. Like as someone who looks at poop all the time, I'm sure we've all seen this on trails. People will scoop up their dog's poop, they'll put it in a bag and then they'll leave it on the trail. It's like, you haven't just left poop now you're also leaving a bag, right? Now you're adding to an even worse problem, especially in marine systems. But yeah, help us think about the barriers. And, you know, for a group that is like out of Washington, I'm sure you guys know these places even better than we do. So we have things like, it's gross. It is gross, right? It's gross, but we all poop. Maybe we need to figure out a societal way to kind of normalize that aspect of it. I don't know. The weight. So weight is a good one, especially if you're like a through hiker or, you know, someone who's trying to keep your weight down when you're hiking from one location to another. Where to throw it away. That's a huge problem. Actually, we've seen that problem down in the Southwest too, where they put out these disposal cans for human waste, and then they had to close them at one park. And I don't remember the park. Do you remember, Ashley? No, but they closed them and they kind of cut them off because then the city was like, we don't want all that poop, you know. So there's all these management implications that are coming. What if I miss the bag? The bags are really big. They're big, I promise. You won't miss if you use them right. Practice at home, maybe, you know, like over the toilet. Laziness, weight impact, cost of wag bags. They're expensive. They can be. I agree with that one. So, you know, those are good barriers. Let me see, what was my last slide here? I think I have one more. Okay. We're going to kind of workshop some of these ideas together as a group. And what we're trying to do here is think through some of those barriers that you've identified and see how we might overcome them. And even think, how can parks and protected areas help this problem where we're having like antibiotic resistance or resistant bacteria spreading throughout an entire ecosystem. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Ashley, if you want to unmute, we can kind of, if people want to unmute, if you want to ask questions in the chat or just talk to us or get on camera, anything, feel free to.
Yeah, we were just planning on using this last little bit of, you know, half hour, 20 minutes or so with you all to chat through solutions, answer questions. I think we've had this section to be a little free form. So. Yeah. Liz, I see your hands up.
I just had a realization, like, as a backpacker, you're supposed to be super aware and cognizant of any smells that you might be carrying. And so my first thought was like, storing this in a bear can with my food is not really an option I'm willing to consider. So that was just another component of this situation that I just kind of came to me. It's like, oh, how do you hang it? Because that seems risky.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe that's another challenge that everyone has to consider, even parks and protected area managers, right? Like, what type of outdoor recreation is this best suitable for? And if you're like on a through hike, right? If you're traveling 1,000 miles or whatever, maybe it's not going to have the same traffic as like a marine beach. But unless, you know, I know that there's a trail that goes through these 2 beaches too. So that's a really good point though, especially the smell and bears and things like that might come, mountain lions.
Yeah, and I've never thought about that because I do a lot of backpacking and carrying bear canisters, and I like never thought about that or never seen any guidance on that. So I'm gonna look into that later and see if there's any guidance about what to do.
Yeah, that's a good one. Thank you, Liz. What about others? What do you think? How do we overcome these barriers? What can the parks do? Right now, by the way, if you're wondering what Olympic National Parks policy is, they have signs at Second Beach Trailhead and I think at Third Beach. And they basically say, dig a cat hole.
Don't be a surface pooper. That's what the info said that I got most recently.
Yeah, and then pack it out 200, no, not pack it out, bury it 200 feet away from water sources, which, like I said, it's impossible on at least one of those beaches because the water comes in. And then think about the water in the winter when the water overtakes the entire beach and comes up to the forest and your poop's still there. You know, I don't think that marine beaches, sometimes we can even get to that 200-foot threshold.
We have a question in the chat, Laura. Connor's asking, have we all heard of land managers handing out wag bags during popular rec weekends like federal holidays? I'm wondering if it's a thing.
Yeah, I've heard about like just discussions about the need for that to happen. I've also heard of places that require them. Like when you get a permit, you have to show evidence that you've purchased those, and it has to be a recent purchase. And, you know, that can be a little limiting, right? If you are someone who might not have a lot of money, that's just going to create a barrier to outdoor recreation for you, right? So, I mean, there's pros and cons of all of this, especially when we look at like the societal level, but that's a really good question. And I think it's going to be a question that lots of parks and protected area folks are going to have to deal with. You know, can they afford it? Where's that funding coming from?
We have another question in the chat. How do you know if the contamination is coming from buried versus surface poop?
Poop is poop. It's all contaminated. You know, it can contaminate either. Like some of those studies from the 80s, they went and dug it back up. And then I think they tested also like further down from it to see what was going on with it. But you can, I mean, it doesn't really matter because those studies showed us that the depth of burial doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you're even like a foot down, that still is able to like filter out and come to the surface. Water can transport it, it moves. It's kind of wild. Like it's wild to think about what bacteria can do.
And I think like another thing that Laura and I didn't talk about that much is we also have like a visitor experience impact here as well. So, you know, for maybe a contamination perspective, it doesn't matter, but there is also the social aspect of seeing human waste on the beaches. So there can be another benefit of that. Leave No Trace also tries to reduce impacts to the visitor experience. And so burying your waste also, you know, hides it from other visitors. And so even though maybe, you know, our past studies have showed that it doesn't really necessarily matter for contamination, but from visitor experience, I personally don't like to see poop just sitting out there either. So that's another aspect they really talk a lot about that is like part of this whole story of human waste management in outdoor spaces.
You know, I'm going to add on to that because I spent 2 months in the field looking at poop. Literally, every day. There's a lot of poop. It was a shitty job. However, when you're out there on a beach, it looks different. If you can imagine like a cat box, that's literally what it looks like. You know, if you've ever scraped a cat box up, it looks the same, but there's tons of flies and there's lots of creatures that like to crawl on it in the sand. So, I mean, it's not just like a pathogenic issue. Like Ashley said, it's a smelly issue. It smells bad. There's toilet paper sometimes that accompanies it. Sometimes there's not. You know, sometimes people just throw their toilet paper on these beaches out into plants, which is kind of gross. And, you know, there's other hygiene issues about human waste that are abundant on those beaches, or at least they were when we were there last summer or 2 summers ago. So Scott has a question. He says, did I understand correctly that so far only about 1/4 of the bacteria analyzed is from humans? Okay, that's where it gets tricky. And we can't say that yet because we still have to do these other human genetic markers to kind of get a better picture. So about 25% from one marker showed that they were from humans, but that doesn't mean that the two other ones aren't going to significantly increase that number. In fact, they have to, because most of those samples were taken right underneath human fecal matter. I know they came from humans, but so we have to wait till we get those other results, and then we'll be able to kind of like do this additive procedure where we're able to determine how many of the total isolates out of all 200 actually came from human sources, including out in the ocean. That's the thing I'm really interested in knowing. How far has this gotten? And think about the ocean too. Think about what feeds on bacteria in the ocean, things like shellfish, right? What happens theoretically if our shellfish start getting antibiotic-resistant bacteria in them, and the people who are using those get into them? Those are things that we're trying to like start pointing more question marks at, because it's not just going back to humans, it's going back to other animals, which even humans consume, but even other animals consume as well, right? There are studies internationally that show us that like clam beds and oysters and things like that have bacteria from human fecal matter in them that are antibiotic resistant. So, I mean, it can happen, and it happens usually from waste transmission. Okay.
Liz, hand up. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I was just curious about the effects of the like privies. Like, are they prone to also transmitting, bacteria and viruses? Are they a better option? Is the better alternative to like just maybe install more privies? Like, what's your take on that?
There's problems with privies in the Olympics, from what I understand. They can leach, right? And what happens when we have those leach fields? What happens if they get contaminated? What happens if they run out, right? Those are questions that I don't have the answers to, but I know that they have their own problems, and there's really not like a perfect solution, right? And that's the problem. I think the best solution we have is to pack it out, or to use like a pit toilet or something like that, or Ashley, what are the ones that are like just like it's like a honey pot, right? Where they're self-contained.
Yeah.
Is there a better name for that? I've always referred to them as a honey pot. I don't know. Might be a better name. I mean, there's different types of facilities that are better than others, but it's still poop. Still got to go somewhere. Is a sandy soil going to be different from organic types soil for breakdown of poop? Yes, it is. It's weirdly different too. So there's a lot of studies, and some of those are out of California, that show us how E. coli will just naturalize along a whole beach from wastewater treatment, like effluent that's come in. And if you think about like soil organic material, right? Bacteria need lots of different things. They also need like carbon inputs and things like that to live on. But in sand, it's a little different. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around how that works. But it does work differently in terms of how long they can stay, how fast they can move. Sand is not as porous as like soils, so it can fly through sand, right? Like it can move through it. It's not compact generally, especially when you have water moving through it. So when it comes to breaking down poop, think about sand and like think about soil. Think about all the different organic materials there that can help break down different type of bacteria in a forest, versus a sand, which is basically these little bitty tiny I don't want to say pieces of glass, but sometimes it's sand. So I mean, you're going to have different types of microbial life in different ones that are able to help break down things, but it can also naturalize in both. I know that's a subjective answer. It's all over the place, but really, and that's the problem with this stuff. It's site specific, right? To do those comparisons. Will you be sharing your findings? Yes. Yep. We have to, because we have a permit from them. So yes. No, it's not Washington DOH. It's Washington Fish and Wildlife and Olympic National Park, and then a tribe that we were working with. All of those folks will get our findings. I mean, we could share it with others. I don't mind.
And it will be, I mean, another way we're disseminating the information is via, like, Laura will publish this work in scientific journals. And so hopefully that will also be another way. And just in case folks don't know, if you ever hit a paywall on any scientific article, you should email the authors because we can share it. So even if,
Yep.
you know, once this work is published too, if that's another way folks want to get the information, email Laura or I, and we can share that work. We're hoping maybe we'll be able to publish it open access.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
For sure. We actually might have to with the new policies too. So we'll see. Does the gel in a wag bag kill and neutralize the bacteria and waste? Is there a treatment available that does? I don't know. That is a really good question. I don't know. I'm gonna
That
look
is a good question. I don't know that either. We'll have to look into that one. I don't know if it does actually neutralize or kill it, or it just helps to gel the waste in a way that's easier to transport out.
Does anyone know that answer to that question here? Maybe some of you are like wag bag pros. I don't know.
I would assume it does not, just for safety's sake. And even if the company claims, I would be skeptical if those claims have been actually backed up by research. So I would err on the side of caution on that one, but I'm going to definitely go into a research hole on that.
Don't reach into them.
A research cat hole.
Also, don't bury your wag bag. Don't bury a wag bag, please, or don't leave it
Don't leave
on
it.
the beach. Neither one of those. You pack it out. If you're bringing them, pack them out. Because that's gonna. Who even knows what kind of hazards that's gonna cause? And in like 5 years, I don't want to have to go find wag bags out in the ocean and do another study on that. You know. So.
We have a question from Katie about how to raise broader awareness for novice hikers or international travels visiting the area for the first time, and that folks with more experience like backpackers may be more interested in wag bags or maybe have had to use them in places where it's required. Do you want to tackle that first, Laura?
Yeah. You know, environmental education has a lot of different routes, right? What we're doing right now is environmental education, talking to community groups. The park can distribute educational material. They could even have outdoor recreationists take a class if they wanted to beforehand, like an online thing, right? They can make it mandatory in the permits to go camping at these areas, that they have that awareness of how to pack out their fecal matter. They can put up signs and remind visitors of how those things should happen once they get to the trail. They can require, like I said, you know, in their permits, they can require receipts to show where you show that you have actually purchased those things and that you intend to use them. So environmental education can happen in lots of different ways. They have their pros and cons, you know, versus different ways. Not everyone's going to read a sign, especially if the sign is really big and cluttered, or if it's just a piece of paper that's put up on a board with 10 other signs, right? Not everyone's going to look at that. But broader awareness, really what we need to do is kind of the social paradigm shift, where we start thinking of our poop as gross, and we start thinking about how we can take personal actions and responsibilities and teach others to do the same, even our children, right? I have a kid. Well, he wouldn't say he's a kid, he's 17. But when we start transmitting that information generationally, and we start normalizing the idea, just like we did with our dogs, we're at a point in time where we're picking up dogs' poop. We can pick up our own poop. You know, a dog's going to have a lot grosser bacteria for human health than our own poop is. Granted, don't play with your poop. There's lots of bacteria that can harm you even in your own poop. But still, yeah. Ashley, do you have anything you want to add on to that?
No, I think the only thing I'll add is, like, you know, if we're thinking to what the social science and recreation literature tells us, is that explaining, especially for novice folks or folks that may be unfamiliar with the recreation system, really honing in on the why is more likely to get compliance. So folks really understand, like, there is a big barrier to pooping in a bag and carrying it out. I get it. But if you explain the why and the benefit that it has for other people or the environment, people might be more likely to comply than just saying this is what the rule is or this is what we recommend. So any communication that can explain that why and connect it back to universals, things like protecting the environment or, again, human health, those can be more effective educational approaches, regardless of whether it's a sign or on a website or in person. That why and connecting it to personal values and, you know, protecting both people and the environment can be more likely to have compliance and folks actually buy into it.
You know, one more thing on that topic. How many of you know where you learned about how to dig a cat hole? You know, where did that come from? There's this social education that we do, right? There's social expectations that we have, and that gets transmitted in like a million different ways. So hopefully like in the next 20 years, we can have that social understanding change a little bit through various routes of education, even, through workshops like this, where we just start talking about it with different stakeholder groups and different folks who are out there. And maybe you suggest it to your friends, or maybe try it out yourself. I don't know. That'd be great. It'd be great not to have so much poop out there. But yeah. So what's the next thing here?
I think Connor's question is the next question. There's another great comment about similar to what you said, Laura, about having to get a permit or watch a video. So it's a great thought and solution. So thank you for sharing that. Connor's question was, I had mentioned this is one of the earliest studies of its kind, and you mentioned a few other past studies. Are we aware of similar studies in the works or other types of studies in Washington State?
That's a tricky question, because when projects are ongoing, you don't talk about them because people scoop your science from you, right? It happens a lot, weirdly. So I don't necessarily know, but recreation ecology is also a real small field. So we kind of know a little bit about what people are doing, even if we don't get into like super specifics about where it's done. I don't know of anyone else who's doing anything like this in Washington State. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I just don't know. Ashley, do you know of anyone?
Yeah, all I was going to mention is the researcher that did some of the work that Laura mentioned in Rocky Mountain National Park, which looked at E. coli in kind of high alpine lakes across different use levels. That individual is now working for an agency in Alaska, I believe, and looking to continue some of that work. I don't know if that is in a marine system or a terrestrial. Again, she's just kind of getting set up, but she is hoping to continue similar research that she had done in Rocky Mountain National Park and some other protected areas in Alaska. So that name on that paper, and I can look it up real quick and link it. That's one to keep your eyes on, as those are some researchers that are hoping to expand this work.
Joseph, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Laura. So I had a question about your timing of when you're actually in the field collecting samples. Are you able to elaborate a little bit more? It sounded like you said you're out there for 2 different years. Kind of, I guess, elaborate on what the timing was and like the frequency. And then also, did you have an opportunity to do any sampling after like a big rain event?
Good questions. So we had when you're developing a research project, you have like this perfect idea of how research will happen, and it never goes like that. I'll put that as the caveat, okay? And if you ever do a research project, you have to have that in your head, because it's never going to work out. So we started not the summer we just finished, but the one prior, so 2021, right? We were there July and August, so for 2 full months, I think. We had some delays. My mom broke both of her legs and her knees. We had like this whole catastrophe that happened. But also, what happened? Does anyone remember what happened in Washington during that time of July 2021? Remember the big heat wave that like killed shellfish out there? Right. So we had that to deal with when we were thinking about shellfish sampling and things like that. What we wanted to do, and what's really needed, is these long-term studies where people are going up there and monitoring at least once a month, every couple of weeks or something like that, because the bacterial stuff is always going to change. It's going to change by the hour sometimes, right? But we started so we did 2 months of outdoor recreation, like high tourism season studies. And then we went back to the field for a couple months after that, after big rainfalls, and we got some samples from that too. But there was a big surprise for us, because, sitting in an office typing up a proposal isn't the reality of being out in Washington. It's rather second or third beach. I think it was third beach. All of the sand on third beach disappears in the winter. We didn't know that. So we got out there. We were like, where did the sand go? What are we going to try to sample? We can't sample a rock, but the ocean gets kind of gnarly out there, but it takes the sand out and brings it back. It's kind of wild. So this is what we call an observational study, where we let the ecosystem kind of guide the work we're able to do, and we let the results guide what kind of questions we're asking, kind of. But yeah, ideally I'd be up there every week doing this. It's expensive though. It's super costly. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. From the data you collected, are you able to have a feeling of, in urban areas, and even where we're at, they always say don't go surfing or go swimming 24 to 48 hours after a rain event. And, that makes sense being in an urban area with all the urban runoff. But do you feel like in somewhere like Second Beach, where you have so many people, in such a compact area, that there's enough bacteria or fecal matter that would accumulate like over the course of a summer that, maybe the national parks, or, there should be awareness about, even in that kind of place, staying out of the water 48 hours after like a rain.
Okay, so we're getting into some technicalities here.
Yeah, so I
And-
guess like
No, it's good. These are amazing questions. Let me try to answer a little bit of that, okay? So the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, has guidelines for how much bacteria, different types of bacteria can be in certain waterways before they have to shut down for recreation. The ocean, like marine systems, they want you to be looking at enterococci, which is it's a different type of bacteria than E. coli. So we're using a different type of bacteria that wouldn't necessarily shut down an ocean system, but it's still indicating fecal pollution, right? If we think about like when we started the research, and this is something I didn't talk about, but do you guys remember what happened up there, like as the pandemic began, the Quileute tribe shut down access to Second Beach. There's no outdoor recreation up there for, I think it was like 16, 18 months, something like that. It was amazing. When we got to Second Beach, it had only like 2 weeks of outdoor recreation on it. We almost have like a perfect control system to see how that bacteria develops over the year and compare it to Third Beach that had outdoor recreation even more that funneled to it, as Second Beach was shut down. But then like, if you think about like the long-term effects of bacteria in the system on Third Beach, when we came in, there's bacteria everywhere. On Second Beach, there wasn't. So does that mean that the bacteria is staying in the system over the winter and coming back? I don't know. Those are questions that we still need to think about. And we need to think about them in terms of like park management. What can they do? What should they do? At what point do we sit there and go, there might be some human health hazards out here, and how and when do we identify what those are and when to shut things down versus leaving them open? They're good questions. There's things we're thinking about all the time. Ashley, do you want to add on to that at all?
No, I think that was a perfect answer. And we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm not sure if anyone has one last quick question or if there's anything else that's pressing that you want to make sure you ask us before we all do other things with our evening. But yeah, I guess before people jump off, I do just want to give another thanks for your time and your great thoughts and your questions. You're always welcome to reach out to Laura and I if other questions come up or you have other thoughts.
I'm going to put my email in the chat. Hold on.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
So for those who don't see the chat on the recording, my email is my name, lara.jacobs@oregonstate.edu. Ashley, do you want to put yours in there? Or you can email me and get a hold of her too.
Yeah, my email is very complicated with the apostrophe, so I recommend emailing Laura. She can pass it on.
And
You can always Google me at Oregon State. My last name, D'Antonio, is pretty unique, and so I'm the only one that comes up.
Nice. And then we did record this, and so we will be distributing that to everybody who registered. And we'll also plug that into our blog post on the subject. So thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with us. And of course, our amazing presenters and researchers for sharing all of this really important knowledge.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just read one comment in the chat. I'm going to finish reading that. Hold up, sorry. So the Quinault tribe got Kalaloch Beach certified with Washington DOH. For commercial harvest of the razor clams, it's only conditionally approved. Closed around the mouth of the Kalaloch Creek during fall and winter. Heavy runoff from rain events elevates the fecal counts. No bacterial analysis. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, so actually that goes into Joseph's question though. One last thing about that. If studies are being done on the shellfish out there, if they're like showing fecal contamination, that would definitely shut off like harvesting and subsistence, hopefully, but that would be up to the tribes that use them, and that would be up to the other land management entities that kind of cover those. So, okay, that's the last thing. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone else.
Thank you so much for hosting and facilitating the Zoom and everything. We appreciate that.
No, we appreciate y'all.